All right, so have you ever heard that saying, tortured artist? You know, the idea that creativity and mental illness are somehow linked.
Well, yeah, like Van Gogh cutting off his ear or something.
Right, exactly. Like maybe those dark emotions or experiences actually fuel great art.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think we've all romanticized that image a bit, haven't we?
But that's exactly what we're going to be diving into today on the Mad Genius Thesis.
Ooh, exciting. So where are we going with this deep dive?
Well, we're using this book called Poets on Prozac as our guide, and it's full of stories from real poets who are wrestling with this very tension.
Okay, poets. So we're talking about the written word, but I'm guessing this applies to other forms of art as well, no?
Absolutely. But I think poetry is especially interesting here because it's often so raw, so emotionally driven.
That's true. You really get a sense of the poet's inner world.
Right. And one of the stories that really grabbed me was about this poet named Denise Duhamel.
Okay, what's her story?
So she struggled with some pretty heavy stuff like anxiety, depression, even eating disorders, and she went to therapy for all of it.
And how did that affect her poetry?
Well, she says that therapy actually freed her up to write about things she was too scared to touch before, like bulimia and violence.
Wow, that's powerful. So she's facing these demons head on, and suddenly her art becomes more honest, more real.
Exactly. And get this, her poem Bulimia ends up getting published in Best American Poetry.
No way. So maybe those tough emotions didn't hold her back. They actually fueled her best work.
That's the question, isn't it? Is it possible that those dark experiences can actually make art more powerful, more relatable?
It makes you wonder if maybe instead of running from those dark places, we should learn to channel them.
Maybe. But Poets on Prozac also explores the flip side of that coin.
How so?
Well, it argues that sometimes severe mental illness can actually block creativity.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, if you're consumed by depression or anxiety, it's hard to focus on anything, let alone create something beautiful.
Right? Like your brain is too busy fighting internal battles to have energy for anything else.
Exactly. And the book gives some pretty intense examples, like Sylvia Plath.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Her work is incredible, but so dark, so intense.
Well, she described her struggle with mental illness as completely all-consuming, like it left no room for anything else.
That's heartbreaking. You have to wonder how many amazing artists have been silenced by mental illness.
Right, like how much potential has been lost because the artist couldn't find a way through the darkness.
But it also makes you appreciate the importance of treatment, right?
Absolutely. Not just for well-being, but also for potentially unlocking creative potential that might be hidden.
Okay, but here's where things get a little more complicated.
Oh, I love it when things get complicated. Tell me more.
So there's this researcher, Kay Redfield Jamison, who studies bipolar disorder, and she talks about this thing called the artistic temperament.
Okay, I've heard of that. Like some people are just naturally more prone to creative thinking and expression.
Yeah, and she thinks this artistic temperament might overlap with manic depressive illness.
Wait, so she's saying there's a link between mental illness and being a creative genius.
It's not quite that simple, but she suggests that the intense highs and lows, the energy, and the expansive moods might actually align with some symptoms of bipolar disorder.
So we're talking about the classic mad genius stereotype, like those larger-than-life figures who created incredible art, but were also incredibly troubled.
Exactly, like Van Gogh, Virginia Woolf, maybe even Beethoven. They all experienced those extremes.
Right, but we can't actually diagnose someone who's no longer living, can we? So how can we know for sure?
We can't, but it raises a fascinating question, doesn't it? Could there be a connection between this temperament and those groundbreaking artists who really push boundaries?
It makes you think about how we perceive mental illness, doesn't it? Like, maybe there are aspects of these conditions that can contribute to remarkable creativity.
But then I get tripped up because it's like, is she saying all creative people are bipolar?
Mm-hmm.
Because that can't be right.
No, she's definitely not saying that. It's more about exploring the potential overlap between these states of mind, the nuances.
Okay, so it's not a blanket statement. It's more about looking at the individual and how their mind works.
Yeah, and how those individual experiences might shape their creative output.
Which brings us to another researcher named Albert Rothenberg, who basically debunks this whole idea of inspiration.
Oh yeah, the myth of inspiration, like creative ideas just magically appear out of thin air.
Exactly. He says that's nonsense. He believes creativity is more about hard work, discipline, and actually putting in the effort.
I kind of like that idea. It takes the pressure off waiting for the muse to strike,
Right. It's more about showing up and doing the work, even when you don't feel inspired.
So maybe instead of romanticizing the tortured artist, we should be celebrating the dedicated artist, the one who keeps creating no matter what.
That's a great point. And it ties into what Poets on Prozac emphasizes, the human element of creativity, the struggles, the doubts, the dedication.
It's about the journey, not just the finished product.
Exactly. And speaking of journeys, let's dive into some of the personal stories from the book. One that really stands out is Thomas Krampf, a poet who struggled with schizophrenia.
Schizophrenia, wow, that's a serious condition. How did that affect his work?
Well, his poetry is known for being really raw and visceral. And he actually credits some of that rawness to his experiences with schizophrenia. He even talks about jumping out of a hospital window during a psychotic episode.
That's intense. So clearly his mental illness had a profound impact on his life and his art.
Absolutely. But here's the interesting part. He turned to an unconventional treatment called orthomolecular therapy, which uses nutrients to balance brain chemistry.
Huh. Interesting. So not your typical medication route.
Right. And he says this treatment allowed him to tap into his creativity without the side effects he had from traditional antipsychotics.
So it's like he found a way to manage his symptoms while still preserving his artistic voice.
Exactly. And it raises this question. Are we too quick to dismiss unconventional approaches, especially when traditional treatments have those negative side effects?
Yeah, it's like a balancing act, isn't it? Finding what works best for the individual while also respecting their creative spirit.
And sometimes that means thinking outside the box.
Right, because there's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to mental health and creativity.
Okay, but now let's talk about Ren Powell, another poet featured in the book. She has bipolar disorder, and her essay, My Name Is Not Alice, challenges this whole romanticized view of the condition.
Okay, so she's pushing back against that stereotype of the bipolar genius.
Exactly. She acknowledges that mania can bring this surge of energy and ideas like, you're on fire, creatively.
Right, right. Like those moments when you can't stop writing or painting or composing.
Yeah.
Just pure creative flow.
But she also says that stable mental functioning is crucial for actually shaping those raw ideas into finished art.
So it's not enough to just have the ideas. You need the focus and discipline to actually bring them to life.
Right. It's like having all the ingredients for a gourmet meal, but not knowing how to cook.
I like that analogy. So is she advocating for medication as the solution?
Well, she actually challenges that idea that medication automatically kills creativity.
Interesting. What's her perspective on that?
She argues that for her, medication can actually enhance creativity by giving her that mental clarity and emotional grounding she needs.
So it's about finding that sweet spot, that balance between the light and the dark, the chaos and the control.
And not letting one completely overpower the other.
Which seems to be a recurring theme with these poets. It's not about erasing their experiences or pretending they don't exist.
It's about finding a way to integrate them, to manage them, so they can create in a way that feels authentic and sustainable.
And that leads us to another fascinating poet featured in Poets on Prozac, Jesse Milner, who struggled with both depression and alcoholism.
Now, his story really dives into this idea of sadness as inspiration. He even calls it his oldest voice, this deep well within him that informs his writing.
So he sees his sadness as a source of creativity.
It seems that way. He doesn't shy away from the darkness. He even talks about this persistent sadness that lingered even after he got treatment.
That's so interesting, this idea that maybe we can't fully escape our demons, but maybe we can learn to dance with them.
Maybe that's the key.
Yeah.
Finding a way to coexist with those darker parts of ourselves without letting them consume us.
And maybe that's where true creative expression lies. It makes you wonder if maybe those darker parts of ourselves become like a thread woven into everything we create.
Yeah, like, can you ever truly separate the art from the artist, you know?
Right. And speaking of artists, there's another poet in Poets on Prozac whose story really stuck with me, J.D. Smith.
Oh, yeah. What was his experience like?
So he was on medication for depression, and he describes this interesting shift in his writing. He used to be super introspective, really focused on his own internal world.
So his poetry was like looking into his soul.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And after he started treatment, his writing started to venture outward. He was engaging with the world in a whole new way.
It's like treatment helped him break free from those internal confines.
Yeah, and what's even more fascinating is that he talks about the act of writing becoming more enjoyable, more liberating after starting medication.
Huh. That's interesting. I feel like sometimes when I'm writing, the words just flow effortlessly. And I wonder if that's connected to my mental state. You know?
It's possible, right? Maybe treatment removes those blocks that were hindering that creative flow for some people.
Yeah, like it clears the path for the words to come out.
It could be, and it challenges the idea that treatment automatically stifles creativity.
Okay, so we've got poets finding liberation in therapy, others challenging romanticized notions of mental illness, some even finding breakthroughs through unconventional treatments. It's a lot to process.
It is. But that's what makes Poets on Prozac so compelling. It shows us that there's no single answer, no magic formula for how this all works.
It's different for everyone.
Exactly. And that's one of the most important things to remember about creativity and mental health. The journey is unique for each individual.
So, what are some other common threads that run through these poets' stories? I'm curious about this theme of authenticity that keeps coming up, like the worry that treatment will somehow change who they are as artists.
Yeah, that's a valid concern.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to medication. There's that fear that it'll flatten out your emotions, make you feel less like yourself.
Right. Like, will my art still be me if I'm not wrestling with all this internal turmoil?
And that's the paradox, isn't it? Because many of these poets actually find that treatment helps them connect more deeply with their authentic selves.
Wait, really? So they actually feel more themselves after treatment?
Exactly. They talk about feeling more present, more grounded, and that allows them to access their creativity in a more genuine way without being overwhelmed by their symptoms.
So it's not about erasing who they are, but creating space for a truer version of themselves to emerge.
That's a great way to put it. And it brings us to another important theme in Poets on Prozac, the relationship between pain and creativity.
Oh yeah, that age-old question. Does great art have to come from suffering?
Exactly. And there's this persistent idea that the tortured artist is somehow more authentic, more insightful.
Like their pain gives them this special perspective.
But Poets on Prozac pushes back against that. Many of the poets initially worried that as their symptoms lessened with treatment, they'd lose their creative edge.
Like they'd become boring if they weren't miserable.
Right. But what they discovered is that creativity doesn't require suffering. In fact, they found that treatment actually allowed them to create in a more sustainable way without being consumed by their illness.
So it's not about romanticizing the pain. It's about recognizing that creativity can thrive even when we're taking care of ourselves.
Exactly. And that leads to another fascinating aspect of Poets on Prozac, the power of language itself. These poets are using language not just to express their experiences, but to heal and connect with others.
It's like they're transforming their pain into something beautiful and meaningful.
And that process of translation can be incredibly therapeutic, both for the writer and the reader.
It's like taking something dark and turning it into light.
Exactly. And speaking of turning darkness into light, let's talk about Jack Houlihan, the last poet featured in Poets on Prozac, who we'll discuss today. He has this really unique perspective as both a doctor and a poet.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. So he's straddling these two worlds that are both deeply human and often intertwined.
And his poetry really reflects that. He writes a lot about the emotional complexities of his medical practice, giving voice to both his patients' experiences and his own struggles.
It's like his poetry is a way for him to process all those heavy emotions that come with being a doctor.
Exactly. And he actually started experimenting with more traditional poetic forms after starting medication for anxiety.
So even though he's taking medication, it actually opened up new creative avenues for him.
It's like another example of how this whole relationship between mental illness, treatment, and creativity can be full of surprises.
We keep coming back to this idea, there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Right, and that's what makes Poets on Prozac such a valuable read. It shows us that there's no simple formula when it comes to creativity and mental health.
It challenges us to think differently about these issues and to see the human side of this whole mad genius debate.
And hopefully to approach these conversations with more empathy and understanding.
You know, it's fascinating to think about those poets who were worried about losing their creative edge if they got treatment.
Yeah, like they thought their pain was somehow essential to their art.
Right, and I get it. It's scary to think about letting go of something, even if it's causing you pain. You know, what if that pain is what makes you...
It's like a part of your identity almost.
Exactly. But what Poets on Prozac shows us is that it's not that simple. You don't have to choose between healing and creating.
Right, you can have both. And in fact, for many of the poets, treatment actually deepened their connection to their creativity.
It's like they were finally able to see clearly without all that noise and turmoil clouding their vision.
Yeah, and that clarity allowed them to tap into a different kind of creative energy, one that wasn't fueled by chaos or instability.
So maybe it's not about erasing the darkness, but finding a way to balance it with the light.
Exactly, and recognizing that creativity can flourish even when we're taking care of ourselves.
So what are some key takeaways from Poets on Prozac that our listeners can apply to their own lives?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's about challenging the stigma around mental illness. Seeking treatment is not a sign of weakness, it's actually an act of courage.
Absolutely. And for anyone out there who's struggling, please know that you're not alone. There's help available, and there's hope for healing.
Another takeaway is that creativity doesn't have to come from a place of suffering.
Right. Let's ditch that romanticized notion of the tortured artist.
And embrace the idea that we can create beautiful, meaningful art while also taking care of our mental and emotional well-being.
And finally, remember that creativity is a journey. There'll be ups and downs, moments of inspiration, and times when you feel stuck.
Be patient with yourself. Trust the process and never stop exploring.
This whole deep dive into poets on Prozac has really made me think differently about the relationship between creativity and mental health.
Me too. It's been eye-opening, to say the least.
And I hope it's done the same for our listeners.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the Mad Genius Thesis.
And remember, keep those creative sparks flying.